Welcome to the Who Knew World War II podcast, a history podcast for young historians by a young historian. My name is Kevin.
And my name is Kai.
And we are a father and son podcasting team. I'm a teacher, but not a history teacher. I teach kindergarten. In this podcast, my 12-year-old historian is going to teach me and you about the history of World War II little by little. We will look at some big events and small events of World War II, and I will ask the questions since I am the student here, and Kai, our young historian, will answer them for us all. All right, in episode 1, we are talking about the Battle of Midway. Now, why are we starting this podcast with this moment in World War II history?
This was one of the biggest naval battles in history, and it was the battle that turned the tide of the Pacific War.
So what was the Battle of Midway, and when did it happen?
The Battle of Midway it happened in June 4th, 1942, and it ended in June 7th, 1942. And the Battle of Midway was when the Americans had intercepted a message saying codenamed AF by the Japanese, and the Americans figured out that it was the island Atoll, the Midway Island, which the U.S. Navy had a base there. And then the Americans had sent 3 carriers to the Atoll, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, and there was fierce air combat against the 4 Japanese carriers. And the Americans eventually sank 4 of the Japanese carriers, and the Japanese has sank 1 of the American carriers named Yorktown.
Now, Kai, can you tell me about some of the major moments or incidents of this battle?
One moment of this battle was that there was a pilot named Dick Best who piloted a SBD Dauntless dive bomber, which we'll talk about later in this podcast. And he has dove and have bombed 2 of the Japanese carriers in one day, which was the only time that an American pilot has ever done that.
Okay, so I'm just curious. So how did the Battle of Midway go for a lot of the American flyers? So you mentioned Dick Best, being the only pilot to successfully bomb 2 different carriers. Or were there? Yeah. How did it go that day for the pilots?
It was very bad for the pilots. The Japanese aircraft carriers had so much flak that almost all the American planes from the carriers were shot down or destroyed by flak from the carriers and like ships.
So I'm curious. I want to stop you, Kai, for a moment. So if I'm watching a movie, like a World War II movie, and I see the airplanes flying in towards a ship, and I see all these like black puffs of smoke by the American fighters or the fighters as are flying in, or bombers, is that flak?
Yes, that's flak. It is called AA for short, anti-aircraft. They are shells shot from guns below, which are meant to shoot down airplanes.
Okay.
And a lot of the planes are also shot down by Japanese aircrafts. Okay. Including the infamous AM-60.
Okay. So the kind of moment that really stood out for you in this battle was the pilot Dick Best and his heroics.
Yes.
So Kai, I'm wondering why do you find this battle, the Battle of Midway, so interesting?
I find it interesting because there are moments where ships shot ships with their shells, and then at the same time there were air battles and dogfights going on in midair, and planes dive bombing ships, torpedoing ships, and it was like a 4-way battle, which before in early 1700s and 1800s, it's like wooden ships just firing at each other, broadsides, which at that time there were just airplanes and ships.
Okay, so there was just so much more happening, and I think one of the things that you've told me before is that you really find naval battles so interesting, right?
Yes.
So there's just so much happening. So let me get that straight. You said there's like ships firing at ships with their big guns, You've got airplanes firing at other airplanes up in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
You've got airplanes shooting at the ships and trying to bomb the ships. And then you've got the ships are trying to shoot down the airplanes. And then you got like ships and maybe submarines trying to torpedo each other and stuff like that too,
Yes.
right? So there's just so much going on.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like an absolutely horrific environment to be in if you were one of those sailors or airmen.
Yes.
No matter what side you were on.
Yeah, so practically be hell.
Yeah. I know that you have an interest in World War II era airplanes, so I was wondering if you could tell me and the listeners a little about the airplanes that stand out to you from this point of the war.
The airplanes that stand out to me will be the SBD Dauntless, which I've talked about earlier. It was used as a scout plane, and during the Battle of Midway was also used as a dive bomber. And it was a slow flyer, but it had quite a capable diving speed and a bomb load. Mm-hmm. And there's the TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, which is a less heard aircraft during the Battle of Midway, which the Americans used. So it was a torpedo bomber, so it would have launched like metal darts into the water, which would have like propeller itself towards the ships, mm-hmm. and when it hit the side of the ship, it would have exploded, making a massive hole in the side. If it works, mm-hmm. and a lot of the Devastators, or all the Devastators in the Battle of Midway, were shot down or destroyed. Another American aircraft is the F-4F Wildcat, which is a very iconic fighter. It was very easy to maneuver. It was a very good aircraft with good armament. And there was also the F-4U Corsair, which is another fighter, which the Navy used, and it was kept being used in other battles of World War II, and it was also used in the Korean War.
Okay.
And the Japanese had the AM-60, which I also talked about, which has very fast and but like not much armor, and okay. it had a capability of like shooting down planes, like a lot of them. Okay. And there was the BN-2 Kates, which were the bombers and torpedo bombers that the Japanese used. They used those to sink the Yorktown.
Okay.
And there was a D-3A Vals, which is a dive bomber that the Japanese use. It's like the SBD Dauntless, but the Japanese version. But instead of like the aircrafts that had the folding landing gears, they had their landing gears hanging down.
Okay.
So they don't fold up. And they were the dive bombers, and they would have carried one bomb under the fuselage and two on its wings, and they would have like dive bombed the ships that the Americans had.
Okay, so which one again was it? Which ones were the torpedo bomb? Not the the torpedo bombers.
There was a TBD Devastator.
So the Devastators dropped the torpedoes in the water.
Yes.
And those are the ones. All those Devastators were taken out. They were all shot down. And so a dive bomber, and I just want to say this for those out there who are listening who are like me and don't know a lot. So what's the difference between a dive bomber and the torpedo bomber? You mentioned the torpedoes drop the bomb like in the water and it goes along, it's got propellers, hits the ship. What about the dive bombers? What kind of bomb are they using, and what are they aiming at?
So the dive bombers was a new technology in the world in that era. So what would have happened was the planes would have been at high altitude, okay, and would have got over the ship. They would have done a full like 180 degree turn, and they would have pointed themselves down, and they would have pulled their air brakes, which are to stop them from going over the speed that like their planes can't handle. And then they would have aimed, and when they got to around 2,000 feet, they would have released their bomb load at the ship they're aiming at, and they would have pulled up. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them, there was a lot of problems with that technique because the pilots can get blackouts from all their blood like flowing like down into their like into their head, instantly goes down to their feet when they pull up. So a lot of pilots got blacked out and crashed into the ocean or the ship itself. Which
in modern days, I've seen on TV, modern jet fighter pilots have like special suits, right?
Yeah,
which like compression suits, which keep the blood up into their head, right?
Yes.
When they do those things.
Yes, which one plane which completed that and didn't, even if the pilots did blackout, managed to make itself up is the Ju-87 Stuka, which was used by the Germans.
Oh, okay.
It had a automatic pulling up system, so even if the pilots did black out, it would have pulled up by itself, so it wouldn't crash.
Oh, wow. Okay. Very interesting. Wow. Neat. And then I'm curious, the Wildcats, those are the ones you said were the fighter pilot, or the fighter planes, right?
Yes.
And I'm curious, just as someone who doesn't know, the non-historian here, in the movie Pearl Harbor, are those green airplanes that the American pilots are flying?
No, those were the P-40 Warhawks, which the British called the Curses P-40 Tomahawks or the Kitty Hawk.
Okay, so a different plane. Okay,
Yes.
Well, thank you, Kai. All right, so how did the Battle of Midway end? What was the outcome of the battle?
The Battle of Midway ended with the Japanese losing all 4 of their aircraft carriers because of the Americans. And if they did keep going, they would have lost all their ships or had to surrender, which the Japanese didn't like doing, because there are other stages of the war where the Japanese wouldn't surrender, and where they would blow themselves up or kill themselves. And the Japanese had to retreat instead of surrendering back to their harbors across their imperial lands to repair their ships. And one of the carriers, which survived the day, which couldn't move, they had to scuttle it.
Okay.
Yes.
So what does it mean to scuttle a ship, by the way?
Scuttle a ship means to blow your ship up. You would blow it up. You'll give an order where they will set up TNT into different parts of the ship where it's vulnerable, and then they will escape in lifeboats, and they will blow the ship up.
So you're basically sinking the ship so the enemy can't have it.
Yes.
You're sinking your own ship. Okay, so Kai, I'm curious now. Where were some of your sources for this information? Where are some of the places that you learned about the Battle of Midway?
I watched some videos from Smithsonian, and I have read articles in the history.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
You have some DK books, right?
DK books, yes. I also use some of the
information
DK
about
books,
the Battle of Midway. Okay, and so that kind of leads me into thinking about this. When we talk about various sources of information about World War II, there's some different YouTube channels that you watch that seem to be good sources, not just for the Battle of Midway, but for other parts of the war, battles and moments. What are those?
They would be I will say there's the Yarn Hub, which he does very good videos, and there is also Simple History, which some of you might have heard of. And there's one particular video from Smithsonian called "The Terrifying Physics of Dive Bombing," which I think you guys out there should watch.
Okay.
And one particular movie is that I like is called Midway, which is a new movie from 2019. And it talks about the pilot Dick Best and him dive bombing those 2 aircraft carriers.
Yeah. So I've seen that movie with you. It's a good movie, a very action-packed movie. I know you're a fan of it. So that's the movie 2019 Midway, which is about the Battle of Midway from the American perspective, the American pilot's perspective.
Yeah.
All right. So there we go, everyone. That is the Battle of Midway. The perspectives and information from our young historian, Kai O'Shea. Thank you, Kai, for teaching me a little bit about the Battle of Midway. I really appreciate it.
No, you're welcome.
And thank you for listening to episode number 1 of Who Knew World War II, a history podcast for young historians by a young historian, by me, Kevin, and
Kai O'Shea.
That's right, and we'll be back very soon where Kai will teach us all something new about a different aspect of World War II history. Now, this podcast is dedicated to our inspiration, my late father and Kai's late grandfather, William O'Shea, and he was a career historian and manager for Parks Canada, later Heritage Canada. His life was all about researching, documenting, and sharing history. He was a key member of the team at the Fortress of Louisbourg National Historic Site during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and he also did a lot of amazing things to document and share the history of the town of Louisbourg, Nova Scotia in Canada, and Cape Breton Island. And you can learn a lot more about him, our inspiration, William A. O'Shea, over at o'sheaarchives.org. And remember to share this podcast if you liked it, and to give us a rating in somewhere like Apple Podcasts, if that's where you listen to it. We're a new history podcast, and we'd like to be noticed. If you're a teacher and educator, we'd love it if you pointed your students in our direction or played this podcast in your class. If you're a student and you're interested in history, please share it with your friends who are interested in World War II history as well. And we'll be back very soon with another amazing episode with some very cool information for you all.